What if I revealed that the most dangerous force in our world isn't hatred or greed, but something far more subtle? What if the greatest catastrophes in human history weren't caused by evil masterminds, but by good people who simply switched off their brains? Imagine this. A brilliant engineer suddenly starts promoting conspiracy theories that defy basic physics. A dedicated nurse begins refusing life-saving treatments based on social media posts. A devoted father makes choices that put his family at risk, all while believing he's protecting them. These aren't monsters or madmen. They're rational, caring people who've been captured by what German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer identified as humanity's most insidious weakness. And here's what should terrify you. It's not happening to those people over there. It's happening to people exactly like us. This isn't theoretical. In 1963, researchers at Stanford University created what they called the Good Samaritan experiment. Seminary students, people training to be ministers, were told they needed to rush across campus to give a speech about helping others. On their way, they encountered a person clearly in distress, slumped in an alley, coughing and groaning. The shocking result? When students were told they were running late, 90% of them walked right past the suffering person without stopping. These weren't heartless individuals. They were future clergy members who had literally just been preparing to speak about compassion. But time pressure had temporarily erased their capacity for independent moral judgment. This is precisely what Bonhoeffer observed in 1930s Germany, leading him to develop what might be the most disturbing insight about human nature ever documented. But before we go deeper, ask yourself this. When was the last time you believed something simply because it felt right, without checking if it was actually true? Hold that thought as we explore a psychological trap that's claiming more minds every single day. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't an academic theorist debating ideas in comfortable lecture halls. He was a young pastor who watched his entire civilization collapse in real time. Born in 1906 to a family of intellectuals, his father was a renowned psychiatrist. Bonhoeffer grew up believing that education and reason would always triumph over darkness. Then came the Nazis, and everything changed. What Bonhoeffer witnessed wasn't a nation of ignorant peasants being deceived by cunning politicians. He watched as Germany's most educated citizens, university professors, medical doctors, church leaders, and respected intellectuals, voluntarily surrendered their ability to think critically. These weren't people lacking information. They had access to the truth. They simply chose to ignore it. Writing from his prison cell in 1944, facing execution for attempting to assassinate Hitler, Bonhoeffer made an observation that still haunts psychologists today. The stupid person is absolutely certain of their righteousness, which makes them completely immune to reason. What Bonhoeffer called stupidity wasn't about intelligence or education. He was describing something far more dangerous: the voluntary abandonment of independent thought. In his prison letters, he explained it this way. One feels as though they're not speaking to a person at all, but to slogans and catchphrases that have completely taken over their mind. Here's what made Bonhoeffer's theory revolutionary. He argued that this intellectual surrender doesn't happen because people are weak or stupid. It happens because our systems actively reward mental shortcuts and punish careful thinking. Consider our modern economy. Social media companies generate billions when users react impulsively rather than think critically. News organizations get more traffic with outrage than with nuance. Politicians win elections with simple answers to complex problems. When people are working multiple jobs, stressed about money, and drowning in information, intellectual surrender becomes a survival strategy. Economists call this rational ignorance. It becomes more efficient to remain uninformed than to invest the enormous time and energy required for genuine understanding. But here's the trap. Individual rationality creates collective madness, exactly what Bonhoeffer witnessed in Nazi Germany. We're not just making individual choices. We're caught in systems designed to make thinking difficult and costly. And our brains, evolved for a different world entirely, are perfectly designed to comply. While economic pressures push us toward mental shortcuts, our brains are actually wired to take them. In the 1950s, psychologist Leon Festinger discovered cognitive dissonance, our brain's tendency to reject information that contradicts what we already believe. But Bonhoeffer understood something that modern neuroscience has now confirmed. This process becomes exponentially worse when people are stressed, overwhelmed, or economically insecure. In other words, exactly the conditions our current systems create. Bonhoeffer observed that stupidity often emerges in group settings. He wrote, "Stupidity is not a psychological problem, but a sociological one." He noticed that perfectly rational individuals would abandon their critical thinking the moment they joined a larger movement or community. This insight was decades ahead of its time. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiments proved exactly what Bonhoeffer had witnessed. When surrounded by a group giving obviously wrong answers, 75% of people will go along with the crowd at least once, even when they know the group is wrong. Now imagine this dynamic in our digital age. A 2018 MIT study found that false information spreads 6 times faster than true information on social platforms. But here's the crucial detail. It spreads faster because false information often feels more emotionally satisfying than complex truths. When someone shares misinformation that confirms their existing beliefs, they're not just spreading lies. They're participating in a system that rewards intellectual shortcuts over careful analysis. The algorithm learns their preferences and feeds them more of the same, creating what researchers call epistemic bubbles, information environments where certain facts literally cannot penetrate. Have you ever noticed how your social media feed seems to show you exactly what you want to hear? That's not coincidence. That's the architecture of chosen ignorance in action. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Salem witch trials weren't conducted by evil people, but by God-fearing Puritans who genuinely believed they were protecting their community. McCarthyism wasn't driven by malicious actors, but by patriotic Americans who sincerely thought they were defending democracy. In each case, intelligent, well-meaning people abandoned critical thinking in favor of group consensus and emotional certainty. If our brains and systems are rigged against us, how do we fight back? Bonhoeffer believed that breaking free requires what he called costly grace, the willingness to think independently even when it's painful, unpopular, or dangerous. But now we understand we're not just fighting social pressure. We're fighting millions of years of evolution and billion-dollar algorithms designed to exploit our mental shortcuts. On a personal level, we can develop what psychologists call intellectual humility, the recognition that our knowledge is always incomplete and potentially wrong. This means actively seeking out information that challenges our beliefs, not to torture ourselves, but to test whether our beliefs are worth holding. Here are specific practices that can serve as daily resistance against intellectual surrender. First, create intellectual friction. Schedule time each week to read thoughtful arguments from people who disagree with you, not to change your mind necessarily, but to test whether your convictions can withstand scrutiny. Second, embrace productive uncertainty. When you find yourself absolutely certain about something, ask what evidence would change your mind. If you can't think of any, that's a red flag. Third, slow down your reactions. Before sharing anything online, take 60 seconds to verify it from an independent source. That brief pause can break the algorithmic cycle that feeds on our emotional responses. Finally, practice saying, "I don't know," when you actually don't know something. In a world that rewards confident ignorance over humble uncertainty, admitting gaps in your knowledge becomes a radical act. But individual practices aren't enough. We also need structural changes that make intellectual honesty easier and more rewarding. This means requiring social media platforms to disclose how their algorithms work and how they curate content. It means funding comprehensive media literacy programs that teach people how to evaluate sources and evidence. It means designing online platforms that reward intellectual humility over tribal certainty. Most importantly, we need economic policies that reduce the stress and uncertainty that make people vulnerable to intellectual shortcuts. When people aren't constantly worried about healthcare, housing, and employment, they have more mental bandwidth for careful thinking about complex issues. Bonhoeffer's theory was brilliant for its time, but here's what he couldn't have predicted. We're not dealing with simple propaganda anymore. We're facing something exponentially more dangerous. Think about it. Bonhoeffer witnessed Nazi propaganda spreading through newspapers and radio broadcasts. But we're living through something far more sophisticated. We've evolved from Nazi propaganda to AI algorithms that know exactly which psychological buttons to push, creating personalized manipulation at a scale never before possible. And now we're entering the age of deepfakes and artificial intelligence that can fabricate reality itself. The threat isn't just escalating, it's targeting the very architecture of human cognition. This isn't just about historical lessons. This is about the wiring of your brain right now. Our minds evolved to prioritize speed over accuracy, to trust familiar sources over unfamiliar ones, and to seek information that confirms what we already believe. These were survival features that helped our ancestors make quick decisions when hesitation meant death. But in our modern information environment, these same features make us vulnerable to manipulation. The mechanism is exactly what Bonhoeffer described. When people feel threatened and uncertain, they become more susceptible to authoritative-sounding explanations that reduce complexity to simple narratives. Here's the crucial insight that makes Bonhoeffer's warning more urgent than ever. We're not just dealing with human manipulation anymore. We're facing systems designed by artificial intelligence to exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Every click, every pause, every emotional reaction is being analyzed and weaponized against our capacity for independent thought. We saw this play out in real time during the COVID-19 pandemic. Doctors, engineers, and lawyers, people with demonstrated analytical abilities, began sharing debunked theories about vaccines and treatments. These weren't failures of intelligence. They were failures of intellectual independence under unprecedented pressure. Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for refusing to surrender his intellectual independence. He was executed by hanging on April 9, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. His last words, according to a fellow prisoner, were, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." His sacrifice wasn't just about political resistance. It was about defending the very possibility of human thought. He understood that when people stop thinking independently, they stop being fully human. They become, in his words, marionettes whose strings are pulled by whatever force happens to be strongest at the moment. But here's what makes Bonhoeffer's final challenge so relevant today. When the pressure to conform is overwhelming, when thinking independently requires courage, when the cost of truth is higher than the price of comfortable lies, who stands fast? The answer isn't found in superior intelligence or education. It's found in the daily choice to remain curious rather than certain, to seek truth rather than comfort, to think carefully rather than react quickly. These aren't heroic acts. They're ordinary practices that become extraordinary when everyone around you has stopped doing them. The tragedy is that intellectual surrender often feels like liberation. Thinking is hard work. It's uncomfortable to hold complex, contradictory ideas in your mind simultaneously. It's painful to admit you might be wrong about something important. But Bonhoeffer argued that this discomfort is the price of remaining human. In a world that profits from our intellectual surrender, choosing to think for ourselves becomes a radical act. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all. We're all susceptible to functional stupidity. The moment we think we're immune, we've already begun to succumb. The price of intellectual freedom is eternal vigilance, not against external enemies, but against our own tendency to stop thinking when thinking becomes difficult. Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity is unsettling precisely because it's so accurate. We see it everywhere. Intelligent people believing obviously false things, educated individuals making catastrophically bad decisions, well-meaning citizens supporting policies that contradict their own values. The problem isn't that people are getting less intelligent. It's that our systems increasingly reward intellectual shortcuts over careful thinking. But within this sobering diagnosis lies genuine hope. If stupidity is partly chosen, it can also be rejected. If it's partly structural, structures can be changed. If it's the result of cognitive overwhelm, we can create conditions that make thinking easier rather than harder. Think of critical thinking like physical exercise. It's uncomfortable at first, but essential for strength. Just as we wouldn't expect to run a marathon without training, we can't expect to navigate complex information without practicing intellectual discipline. The mental muscles required for independent thought need regular use, or they atrophy. The next time you find yourself absolutely certain about something, the next time you catch yourself dismissing contradictory evidence without consideration, the next time you feel the comfort of having all the answers, remember Bonhoeffer's warning. Functional stupidity doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispers that you already know everything you need to know. And in that moment of recognition, you have a choice. Will you surrender your mind for the comfort of certainty, or will you choose the more difficult path of intellectual independence? The question Bonhoeffer leaves us with isn't whether we're smart enough to avoid stupidity. It's whether we're committed enough to keep thinking when thinking becomes inconvenient, uncomfortable, or costly. In a world that profits from our intellectual surrender, choosing to think carefully and independently becomes one of the most important things we can do. Here's my challenge to you. This week, identify one belief you hold strongly and spend 30 minutes researching the best arguments against it. Not to torture yourself, not to become paralyzed by doubt, but to practice the kind of intellectual courage Bonhoeffer died defending. If your belief survives honest scrutiny, you'll hold it more confidently. If it doesn't, you'll have learned something valuable about the difference between conviction and truth. The future of human dignity might just depend on how we collectively answer Bonhoeffer's challenge. If this video has made you question something you thought you knew for certain, that's not a weakness. It's the beginning of intellectual courage. Share this with someone who isn't afraid to think deeply, even when it's uncomfortable. Because in a world designed to profit from our intellectual surrender, the simple act of thinking carefully becomes the most important form of resistance we have. And here's what I want you to remember. Every time you choose curiosity over certainty, evidence over emotion, careful thinking over quick reactions, you're not just protecting your own mind. You're defending the very possibility of human wisdom in an age of artificial stupidity. What's one belief you're willing to question this week? Let me know in the comments. And let's commit to being the kind of people who stand fast when everyone else has stopped thinking.